thank you very much for the invitation today and actually for the chance to work out for myself whether I am actually a post-liberal or not. Thank you to Hungary for acting as a kind of national think tank for the ideas we're discussing today. Two apologies too. First of all, I'm going to read a speech, which is sometimes a bit less interesting to listen to than people ad-libbing. And also my argument is very much based on domestic politics. We've been talking more about the international scene so far, and it's based also very much on my own country, the United Kingdom. Anyway, here I go. So we're often told that we're living in a kind of interregnum in politics and economics, that the old system is dying and the new system is yet to be born. But I'm not really sure about that. I think we are already essentially living in a broadly post-liberal era in much of the West. The background noise to politics for most of my life has been what one might call metropolitan openness. It began with the Thatcher revolt against post-war social democracy and union power, which saw the denationalisation of finance and then a loosening of constraints on labour and capital, the opening of the global economy, you all know the story, dramatic changes to the global economy, particularly in rich countries, especially after China's entry into the WTO in 2001, as Balázs was just mentioning. What one might call this hyper-globalization era was characterized by very rapid growth in China and other parts of the developing world, decent, although unspectacular, growth in most of the rich world, but accompanied by a very sharp rise in inequality and rapid deindustrialization and big regional imbalances in many rich countries. From the 1980s to the end of this hyper-liberalization phase that I would place in 2016, for obvious reasons, politics was best summed up in the slogan that the right won the economic argument, but the liberal left won the cultural argument. And as politics is downstream of culture, that was the most important victory. In society, in the UK and comparable countries, we saw the doubling of the professional and managerial class from the 1960s until the 2010s to around 1/3 of all jobs, and the related expansion of higher education. This produced a kind of light bulb-shaped social structure and an expanded elite class that merged the traditional elites and asset-rich with what one might call the cognitive meritocracy, the exam-passing classes from all levels of society. This expanded elite that I've labelled elsewhere the anywhere class oversaw and in many cases advocated for a rapid liberalisation of social norms. If you think back to Britain in the 1980s, about half of adults still thought that homosexuality was wrong. They agreed with the statement that a man's role is to go out to work and a woman's role is to look after the family. A supermajority expressed a belief in Christianity and pride in country. Fertility levels were still close to the replacement rate of 2.1. Most professional people did not have a university degree, and net immigration was running at less than 50,000 a year. 40 years later, the picture has obviously changed dramatically. One result is that politics has come to revolve as much around education-based liberal conservative value divides as around the old left-right socioeconomic divides. So from the early 1990s until the Brexit vote in 2016, I think it's fair to say that what the populists, with some reason, call the Uni-Party in Britain, agreed on many of the big things. I mean, I won't read them all out to save time, but this is essentially a summary of what is sometimes called the double liberalism, the economic liberalism and the socio-cultural liberalism. There were obviously some differences between centre-left and centre-right on the size of the state, levels of redistribution and immigration, but also a broad consensus on how to prosper in the age of hyperliberalism. And, to be fair, there were many good things about that consensus, especially if you were a woman or a member of an ethnic minority group. The expansion of higher education produced a bigger and more open elite than in the immediate post-war period. Many dirty and dangerous jobs in heavy industries were replaced with knowledge economy jobs in comfortable offices. There were also, however, many people in the UK, especially outside the greater southeast, who felt like losers from this hyper-liberal consensus. And their number grew, especially after the great economic slowdown that followed the financial crisis in 2007-8. This was not just about inequality, deindustrialization, and the loss of well-paid jobs for people of average or even below average academic ability. For there are also three deeper trends that have been eroding centuries and even millennia-long certainties and contributing to a sense of disorientation for many people. The loss of religion is one. The changing relationship between the sexes is another. Women's financial autonomy and mass entry into work outside the home and public life represents a big increase in human freedom. But many men have lost their role as main family provider and found nothing satisfactory in its place. There is a third, deeper shift too. Within the lifetime of today's young adults, the ethnic majority in many democratic nation states in Europe and North America will fall below half of the population. In Britain, the post-1997 opening to immigration means that today 20% of the population is foreign-born, and the white British core has shrunk from almost 90% in 2000 to around 70% today, even lower in England. Just 53% of births in 2025 were to white British mothers. Just 53%. Britain is on track to become a majority-minority country sometime in the 2060s. The Brexit vote of 2016, and perhaps the first vote for Trump too, was a protest vote from not only those who felt they had suffered from the economic consequences of hyperliberalism, but also those who felt a loss of direction as a result of those big cultural shifts. But fortunately, democracy works. Democracy did work. It gave these people a voice through the rise of populist parties all over Europe. It has worked, of course, imperfectly. After the Brexit vote, a large section of the British elite tried to reverse the vote. When the impasse was finally broken by Boris Johnson with his decisive election victory in 2019, the promise to reduce immigration and to start levelling up the country, a promise that would not have been made without the Brexit vote, both of these promises were dramatically broken. Nonetheless, there is a new consensus in British politics and culture, much of which even a Labour government is forced to adapt to. It is a consensus replicated in many other Western countries. After 30 years of metropolitan openness, the background noise is now one of provincial insecurity. 20 years of stagnant incomes has cast a cloud of gloom over British life, but it has also forced the political class to think much harder about over-regulation and state capacity, and to recognise, in the words of the very hyper-liberal Financial Times columnist Janan Ganesh, that liberal democracy needs to be a bit more democratic and a bit less liberal. There is also now a broad consensus, as I say, including a reluctant Labour government in most cases, on the need for a different national citizen-first and tough-love set of priorities. That consensus would include the acceptance that we've been far too open to the outside world and that a pause in legal immigration and much tougher measures against illegal immigration is needed. Acknowledgement that higher education has overexpanded, an apprenticeship is at least as good a start in working life for most young people. The recognition that welfare spending is out of control and too many people are gaming the system. The need for regional rebalancing to the economy. An openness towards some degree of reindustrialization, reshoring, the idea of strategically important national industries, and limits to free trade. More investment in defense industries and the armed forces. A much greater skepticism about progressivism, from the BLM ideology to the trans movement, and its celebration of fluidity, whether of borders or genders. And much more concern, partly focused now on the regulation of social media, on polarization, anomie, and loss of meaning, especially for young people. There is much in that list that is supported more in rhetoric than actual policy, it is true, but the centre-right in the UK, now meaning the Conservatives and the Populist Reform Party, which continues to lead in the polls, will ensure that this new consensus remains at the heart of British politics. But is it post-liberal? Well, there are many schools of post-liberalism, often defined by their distinct critiques of liberalism itself. Liberalism in most versions is seen as a bloodless ideology focusing too much on individuals and individual rights and freedoms, as Gladden was just saying, constraints on power and value neutrality, that dispatches the human needs for community, belonging and meaning to the private sphere. Liberalism is seen as drifting too far from the forces of flag, faith and family that once provided connection and meaning. The American version, associated with some people in the court of Donald Trump, tends to be more religious and aggressive towards liberalism. Writers like Patrick Deneen and the even more radical Adrian Vermeule regard liberalism as a form of nihilism that encourages our worst selves, especially when combined with free markets. But the answer of the religious post-liberals is that the good society requires virtue to precede freedom, and implicitly a return to faith, usually Catholicism. This sounds more pre-liberal than post-liberal, as Gladden was just saying. The more mainstream post-liberal critique of liberalism is that it is hard to derive an idea of the common good or the national interest from it, because it is designed to accommodate an endless variety of individual beliefs, priorities, and goals. Liberalism demands that if you pay your taxes and obey the law, neither society nor the state can interfere with you, with your individual freedom, even if you are an Islamic extremist who preaches hatred of the West. Post-liberalism's answer is that the common good must prevail, but that begs the obvious question of who defines it. Maurice Glassman's Blue Labour, probably the best known variant of post-liberalism in the UK, is more a vibe, left on economics, right on culture, than a political philosophy or coherent policy programme. Glassman's book is subtitled The Politics of the Common Good, but provides no answer to the question of how we can arrive at a consensus on the common good in modern societies with such diverse interests and values. Matt Sleet, in his recent book on post-liberalism, complains that it is often little more than an immature rage against liberalism. It is true that some variants do flirt with illiberalism and religious authoritarianism, or in the case of Blue Labour, hardcore socialist economics and nostalgia, including the quaint idea that working class people are longing to go back to working in factories. There is a widespread regret at the loss of community in the West, with the accompanying reduction in trust and volunteering. Similarly, people regret the loss of stable family life. Nearly half of British children are not living with both their biological parents at the age of 14. But the weakening of community and family often happens because people place their own freedom and desires first. People want community, but many of them want wealth, freedom, and mobility even more. We might regret, for example, losing the sense of a single national conversation when there were only 3 television channels to watch. But few of us want to give up the extraordinary choice of entertainment we now enjoy. Nonetheless, there is still wide support for constraining the excesses of liberalism, both economic and cultural. We need a course correction, as Adrian Pabst and other more moderate post-liberal voices have argued, a better liberalism that speaks to the priorities of the somewheres at least as much as the anywheres, without jettisoning pluralism and the essentials of historic liberalism. Post-liberalism doesn't require a shiny new philosophical system, though the varied sources it draws upon, Aristotle, Catholic social teaching, communitarianism, do lend it some intellectual glamour. One way of thinking about post-liberalism as a course correction is seeing it as a political force that seeks to reproduce some of the background factors that helped liberalism to work well enough in earlier decades, without actually returning to the 1950s. Post-war liberalism in the West benefited from many underlying factors that are now either absent or seriously weakened. We had rapidly rising incomes for most people. The moral constraints provided by residual religious belief and social deference, stable family life, large ethnic majorities with a pre-political solidarity reinforced by the recent experience of war, created strong national identities and common norms across social classes. But in a world of no growth, polarizing algorithms, runaway immigration, weakened families and national attachments, and with faith in our political classes badly dented, in Britain's case, thanks to the military failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, the financial crash, Brexit without a plan, the COVID failures, and frequent changes of Prime Minister, liberalism is under strain and needs a helping hand from post-liberal priorities. My own version, that I would characterize as belonging to the moderate left conservative school of post-liberalism, maybe a liberal post-liberalism, has three elements. Again, I won't read them all out, there isn't time, but my first category is essentially a return to just conservative common sense, which much of progressive liberalism has jettisoned. I think that should be combined with a market-friendly national social democracy, which means less market in some areas, like the management of public utilities, but actually more market in areas where competition is weak. And I think perhaps, maybe somewhat more originally, a kind of class and regional settlement that leans into somewhere priorities. I think there is a crisis of demoralization in many of our societies, especially among those who have not passed the exams and got into the professional and managerial class. We need to try a lot harder to do something about our grotesque regional divides. We also need a fundamental rethink of post-school education. We need a huge shift in resources from higher education to further education, as we call it in the UK. Essentially, we're massively overproducing people with generalist academic skills, even though the size of the so-called PMC, the professional and managerial class, is not growing. It's actually been pretty static for the last 15 or 20 years, but we keep churning out people with these generalist academic skills while lacking the kind of vocational technical know-how to keep the show on the road. I think we also need to provide far more organized outlets for public spiritedness. I mean, this is not a particularly revolutionary manifesto, but I think it's still pretty ambitious, and it cuts across, notwithstanding what I was saying about the new consensus, there are still very powerful liberal assumptions in key areas. And what I'm proposing cuts across those liberal assumptions in various different areas, much lower immigration, obviously. We should also, to the extent immigration does continue, favour those who fit easily into Western cultures and acknowledge that in the way that even the Danish Social Democrats are now doing. And And we should regard discomfort at rapid demographic change as a perfectly legitimate feeling. We need to challenge the economism of most modern liberals when it comes to so much social policy. Culture does matter. We need to actively promote family stability and higher fertility, and acknowledge that character formation is often more important than parental income in life chances. We need to restore, as has been discussed already, we need to restore more authority to local and national government and away from the judiciary and international conventions and institutions like the EU. We need better elites. This is one of post-liberalism's favourite themes. It is certainly true in Britain, where we need a class of politicians who can speak across the anywhere, somewhere divide, where they don't yet exist, and I hope they will one day. We don't want to replace the anywhere tyranny with a somewhere tyranny. Both worldviews are needed in our complex society. And also because modern electorates are both liberal and conservative. We saw in the pandemic that there was a very strong support for draconian restrictions on liberty for what was perceived to be the common good. But most people place a very high value on security and familiarity. But the same is true about individual freedom. And no political party will get elected in most rich countries without accepting both of the post-war social revolutions, at least in Western Europe, the welfare revolution of the 1940s and 50s and the equality revolution of the 1960s and the 1970s. It is part of the post-liberal critique of modern liberalism that it promotes a shallow understanding of freedom as lack of constraint on our individual desires and projects of self-actualization. Whether that is true of liberalism, it is certainly true of the human condition that we often prioritize short-term desires over our longer-term best interests. Most of us would welcome institutions and cultural norms that nudge us to make better choices, but beware to anyone who thinks they know our own best interests better than we do. After the relative calm of the second half of the 20th century, at least in much of the West, huge challenges are now piling up, while the political ability to manage them is confronted by democratic electorates more demanding and divided than ever before. A course correction for liberalism in the direction of a post-liberal left conservatism would align priorities more closely with majority preferences and help in achieving a soft landing. As the American Democratic politician Daniel Patrick Moynihan put it, the central conservative truth is that it is culture, not politics, that determines the success of a society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change culture and save it from itself. Thank you very much.